Central issues and the base for the digital content sector, they are evolving into important online value chains. What is the importance of media art archives? Which diversity in the approach can be observed? How can these archives create added value and be monetized? And how can these archives contribute to the developments in the media art markets and may form a base for online platforms? I'm Manuela Navot from Ars Electronica Export, and I'm very happy to welcome you at this panel. Next to me is Oliver Grau, Dagmar Schink here on the stage at the Ars Electronica Festival. And in addition, I want to welcome our online panelists, Christiane, Paul, Mariano Sadon, Rafael, Lozano-Hemmer. A very warm welcome. As Gerfried Stocker, our CEO, artistic head, as he observed in the first week of our pandemic reality, he said, no digitalization offensive of any government could have done what Corona is actually doing to us. We are online, our bodies merged with the digital realm in a speed that actually nobody was expecting. If we see this positive or not, we find ourselves in a world in which we increasingly rely on online content. And media art archives and platforms are no exception. I would like to introduce you to our first panelist. This is Christiane Paul. Christiane Paul is Chief Curator, Director of the Sheila C. Johnson Design Center. She is Professor in the School of Media Studies at the New School, as well as Adjunct Curator of Digital Art at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York City. Her book, Digital Art, published by Thames and Hudson in 2015, is widely known and is one of the key literature about themes raised by digital artworks such as viewer interaction, artificial life and intelligence, political and social activism, networks and telepresence, and issues surrounding the collection, presentation, and preservation of digital art. At the Whitney Museum, she curated exhibitions including programmed rules, codes, and choreographies in art from 1965 to 2018. And she is responsible for Artport, the Whitney Museum's portal to internet art. So let us hear more what Christiane Paul is explaining.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I'm going to give a very brief overview.
Ich glaube, Sie brauchen ein Zeichen.
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. I'm going to give a very brief overview of Artport, the Whitney Museum's platform for internet art. The goals of Artport are to provide access to original works of net art commissioned for the platform, as well as documentation of new media art exhibited at the Whitney and works in the museum's collection, to introduce visitors to net art within a museum context, but also to chronicle how the medium has developed over time. So far, I have commissioned more than 100 projects for Artport since 2001. These works were commissioned under non-exclusive licenses, meaning that the artists still retain copyright. But a few years ago, we also decided to bring Artport Artport as a whole into the Whitney Museum's collection, the artists are still retaining copyright, so we're basically playing it both ways. So within the Artport commissions, I'm trying to give an overview of the breadth and scope of the medium. The works differ quite a bit. One of the most recent ones is New York Apartment by Sam Levine and Tiga Brain, in which the artists scraped a prominent real estate website and basically combined all of the listings for New York into one continuous big apartment, thereby creating a portrait of the real estate market. Part of the site also are various 3D views, virtual views of this apartment, and you see the planar view here. A very different approach is taken by Michael Mandyburgh's live study, which essentially is an endurance performance. You can watch Michael painting for about an hour every day, portraits of his studio assistants, all of them who have worked for him over the years. The portraits are quite coded, so the size of the canvas basically corresponds to the hours and years that they have worked for Michael. And he is also learning to paint or refreshing his painting skills in the process. Yet another example would be Public Key, Private Key by Jennifer and Kevin McCoy, which questions donorship to the museum and also the secondary art market. What the artists did was create a film in which a blockchain key is embedded, and they donated this film to the Whitney Museum. They then opened up an application online for people to basically submit an application for becoming an official donor of the work. So they selected the 50 most original applications, and all of the people who submitted that are officially listed as donors of the work to the Whitney Museum now. So donorship obviously is something that usually is reserved for very rich people. So many of the applicants really appreciated the opportunity to become part of this. The donorship is traced via the blockchain, and the donors can still trade the work. So this project is also questioning the secondary market. Another series I'm doing is Sunrise Sunset. So every morning and every evening at sunrise and sunset, the Whitney's website is taken over by an art project for 30 seconds. So it's kind of a live intervention into the site. One of the recent ones is Christine Luca's Speculative Habitat for Sponsored Seabirds, in which you encounter avatars of seabirds that the artist is sponsoring through an environmental site. The fact that the penguin and the flamingos share the same space here also points to the effects of climate change. And the most recent project is Looted by American Artist, in which American basically boards up the museum website. All of the images of works are replaced by images of these wooden boards, alluding not only to the recent protests and riots in New York and other cities in the US, but also to the fact that many museums have in their collection what could be considered loot. So the value and relevance of Artport are really to integrate net art into the exhibition program of a museum, to introduce a more general audience to the medium of net art, to chronicle developments in net art over time, to support artists by commissioning their work, but also adding net art to a museum collection and thereby committing to its preservation. I also just briefly want to mention that Artport works also get shown within the museum space. So what you see here is a screenshot of a project by Casey Rios, Software Structures, in which he basically points to the roots of software art in conceptual art being an instruction-based medium, and we recently showed this project in the museum space as part of the exhibition programmed. So what you see here are projections of Casey's work next to a wall drawing by Sol LeWitt. I want to just briefly talk about net art preservation. I think this is crucial and one of the reasons why net art really needs to be collected. So in 2013, the Whitney undertook an initiative to preserve the world's first collaborative sentence by Douglas Davis. This was the earliest work that entered the museum's collection in 1994. And became non-functional. And what we decided to do was basically create two versions of the work. One historical one where all the broken links link back to the Wayback Machine, and then a live version where you can still contribute to the sentence. I also want to point out that the Whitney really has formed a network of partners when it comes to collection and preservation. So Artport partners specifically are Rhizome and New York University. We have worked with NYU on the preservation of net art projects. And there are also partnerships with Tate and the Liverpool Biennial. We have co-commissioned several pieces with them. The Whitney in recent years has undertaken a media preservation initiative, MPI, which basically has created a centralized platform for artist interviews, images, videos, and a lot of documentation information. And through two spaces, Archivematica and Resource Space, has really created a platform for integrating preservation and access systems. Once again, we have worked with NYU, Computer Science, and the Institute of Fine Arts to preserve and document net art pieces. You see a listing of them here. And most recently, students have worked on documentation of Barbara Lattanzi's C-SPAN ×4. This work actually received an honorary mention at Ars Electronica in 2005, if I'm correct. So you're looking at a breakdown of the web assets here, and you see an example of some of the code analysis. So I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christiane Paul. As a next, I would like to introduce you to Oliver Grau. Oliver Grau is first chair professor for image science at the Danube University since 2005. Oliver Grau was founding director of the Media Art Histories conferences, and he has received several awards for books, including Mediale Emotionen from 2005, Imagery of the 21st Century from 2011, and recently, and this is what I would like to show you, Digital Art through the Looking Glass, which was actually just recently published. Grau's virtual art From Illusions to Immersion was published in 2003 and by Leonardo and MIT Press, and is the most quoted art history monograph since 2000. In this early book about concepts of interactive art, interface design, telepresence, and image evolution, he is contextualizing the impact of virtual reality on contemporary conceptions of art. And Oliver Grau is based in Krems, Austria. This is why he is actually here standing next to us and can join us here on stage. He developed international master programs like Image Science and the Joint Master Media Arts Culture for the Danube University in Krems. And Oliver initiated ADA, one of the first and still existing archives for digital art, and he initiated this already in 1999. for which he conceived also scientific tools for digital humanities. Let us hear more about ADA, a living archive, and its challenge to document an ever-changing world of media art.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Hi, Ars Electronica community. Thank you for having me. The corona pandemic has unmistakably shown how closely interconnected the world has become through globalization, economically, technologically, and more culturally. Life is often thematized by complex digital imagery. We discover that what we may call now a political iconography of the 21st century, artworks dealing with mega topics like image revolution, climate, finance virtualization, or surveillance. Over the last 5 decades, digital art has evolved. It can take, as we know, highly disparate forms and includes genres as genetic, glitch, interactive installations, net art, and virtual reality art. However, this art is significantly lost due to rapid technological change. Consequently, artworks created just 10 years ago can often no longer be exhibited, although there are hundreds of festivals around the globe. Museums and libraries rarely include more complex media art in their collections, and those that do struggle to sustain finance, expertise, and technology for the preservation of artworks through strategies such as migration or emulation. But also the documentation of digital art has not much supported in the past, as expressed in the International Liverpool Declaration, signed by more than 450 scholars and museum heads from 40 countries. There is urgent need to create a stable international platform of interoperable archives. As research-oriented documentation, the Archive of Digital Art, ADA, exists since the year 1999, growing into perhaps the most complex resource available online, a platform for scientific information and social communication. Hundreds of leading media artists are represented by several thousand documents with more than 3,500 articles and a survey of more than 1,500 institutions. There are also more than 150 scholars and media art historians involved in making ADA a collective project. The system offers a tool for artists and specialists to individually upload information about works and inventions. Over the last years, some 5,000 artists were evaluated, of which more than 500 fulfilled the criteria of 5 artworks and/or published articles to become a member of ADA, resulting in the documentation of many of the most relevant artists of all continents. And now, ADA recently received, together with the Art University Linz and Angewandte Vienna, a 1.2 million euro grant to develop ADA into a research, and this is most important, a cost-free teaching tool for all art schools and key information resource for galleries and museums. Therefore, we would like to invite all artists and scholars who fulfill the criteria, the magic number of 5 exhibitions and articles, to become a member now, to make your profile, upload information on your works and exhibitions. We document, as you see here, interfaces and displays and other inventions, soft and hardware configurations, literature, keywords, and high-res visuals to allow the next generation of artists to learn with the best information, to give scholars the research resource they need, and museums, if they want to start a collection, the essential information. And keywording is bridge building. Important innovations such as interface or genetic art were carefully selected from hundreds of publications and festival documentations, along with keywords, for example, from the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus and the Warburg Index that play a role in traditional art history, such as body or perspective, with a bridge-building function. For the Bridging Thesaurus, new keywords are empirically selected to achieve a comprehensive overview of the knowledge domain of media art. This vocabulary is limited to around 400 terms. The idea is to overcome the so-called ghetto situation of digital arts and allow artists and scholars themselves to do the keywording. So basically the amateurs do the keywording and not professional archivists, and that's why we limited it to a couple of hundred terms. In relation to other vocabularies, ADA keywords have a unique hierarchical schema based on a triad of aesthetics, subject, and technology. And we started empirical research too, as you see here, Geoffrey Shaw's related artworks to immersion and panorama visualized by Renato Sosa. Additionally, Ada's Lightbox is both scholarly and social, promoting comparative analysis of media artworks. This tool permits community members to assemble individual arrangements for their research. The collective archive of digital art counts many digital art installations, and it is important to contextualize them within media art histories, for example, the one of immersion. But we have also the histories of artificial life, phantasmagoric imagery, automata, etc. There are hundreds of traditions, and through comparison, we might better understand what is really new in digital art. The worldwide museum community is more than 55,000 institutions strong. The US has more than 17,000 alone, and Austria hundreds with flagship institutions like the Belvedere. It may seem that this infrastructure in all its diversity and history is such a mighty monolith that drastic change would be difficult to imagine. But the digital age enters with force. It comes with its own digital-born arts and cultures which have their own history. However, digital art is not collected systematically in a concerted strategy by museums because the basic structures of the 240-year-old institution date back to a time, as we know, when different artistic media prevailed. That is why we as citizens are facing a massive problem in terms of democratic discourse via contemporary art. Although in Europe, most museums are financed by our taxes, they can't fulfill their official task in the field of digital art. Comparing the worldwide budget for preservation of traditional art with electronic art, we understand how inadequate the support is, statistically almost immeasurable. A systematic preservation requires the cooperation of museums and libraries into specifically funded expertise networks. To achieve this, we need a concerted policy of collection and preservation on a much larger scale. One strategy to enable the museum to fulfill its duties in our networked democratic societies would be the establishment of a concerted museum network of expertise and preservation. The faster this essential modification can be carried out, the smaller the gap in the cultural memory in the 21st century. Thank you so far.
Thank you very much, Oliver. Rafael Lozano-Hemmer is our next panelist. He is joining via Zoom, and he just had a talk. Yeah? I would like to introduce you to him shortly, what I can tell you about Rafael if you don't know him. Rafael Lozano-Hemmer is a Mexican-Canadian media artist and very well known for his theatrical, interactive, participatory installations in public spaces. Done them actually worldwide. His sculptures and installations can be found in collections by MoMA, Guggenheim, Tate, MUAC, Mona, ZKM, and others. He was recently the subject of 9 solo exhibitions, including one at the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C., at the APMA Museum in Seoul, and a mid-career retrospective co-produced by the MAC in Montreal and SF MoMA. In 2019, his interactive installation Border Tuner, I'm sure you also have heard about it, connected people across the US-Mexican border using bridges of light controlled by participants and their voices on both sides. Rafael, super that you're here. You just had a talk before we actually came together, and you explained the importance why media artists could see conservation and a focus on documentation as a way to fund also the artist's life, and the importance why documentation of a work of media art is actually really crucial. Can you please sum up maybe in 5 minutes for us, for those who haven't seen your talk and heard your talk, please?
For sure. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. The idea with my best practices for conservation of media artists is that conservation needs to be a fundamental part of an artist's practice, only because we're seeing entire generations of artists being lost in art history due to the fact that their work is just not functioning anymore. Crucially, when I speak to colleagues about conservation, we are all, as artists, in survival mode. We are just obsessed over the next piece that we are going to work on. We don't really have time to be looking at what we did 10 years ago. And so one of the things that I've trying to establish is a series of procedures for collectors, museums, artists to have some kind of expectations over what is it that an artist can and should do for conservation, and crucially, to be able to monetize the work that goes into the maintenance of the work over time. So the idea, the way that I think that artists may start to be interested in my best practices is the idea that, that this is an income stream for the studio that allows the artist to maintain operations rather than a headache that, that they will be mortified about whenever a piece of theirs fails. So there's many different ideas, like the idea that the artist should offer 0 years of warranty is a very important one. The idea that the purchase, acquisition of a work is actually the acquisition of a responsibility for preserving an artwork, and that the artist should give the open source code, the schematics, the firmware, all of the materials for the collector to be able to conserve the work themselves, but give them a path for the studio to be able to be hired, almost like a service industry, if you will, to be able to maintain that work over time. So basically, the idea is to avoid a situation where a collector or a museum buys a work of media art, it stops working, the gallery no longer has a technician who can support that, the artist is now high in Jamaica, and so he's not to be found. So therefore, what is the pathway for this artwork to have a life after the artist disappears? And I think that that's also a way to, control the way in which your own artwork can be reperformed, and also to be in the table when big museums or collections or different kinds of initiatives talk about preservations, for the artists to also be not just the source of the problem, but also the source of the solution, and get paid for that. So the best practices for media art, from an artist perspective, it's a document that you can find in my studio's GitHub, is github.com/anti-modular, all one word, and you can find that there. There's many different very practical points about how, as artists, we can help in reperforming our artworks into the future. And I think I'm 52 years old now. I'm starting to think about a legacy. I'm thinking about, for example, there's an incredible artist, well, there's a number of incredible Latin American artists. Like I'm thinking of Julio Leparc. Julio Leparc is a pioneer of light art. And when we think about light art, we think about Turrell, we think about Flavin, we think about, all of these masters who had the Guggenheim and the D Art Foundation and a whole bunch of different people conserving their work. But Leparc was a pioneer, a very important artist, like Cosice before him and so on. But the thing is, there was nobody conserving their work until the Daros Foundation, Daros Latin America Foundation in Switzerland came in and sort of managed a lot of these pieces. And now Leparc is in the place where he should be. People recognize that this Latin American pioneer actually made a big contribution. But that was only thanks to that support of a foundation which brought in the interest to conserve his work. And so his work was saved. But we can't say the same of Marcos Curtix, the great Mexican artist, for example. There's no foundation that is actually recovering the archives of this great artist, and therefore he may be lost in the future. So I'm very curious about how these discussions, this archives, this conservation, have a dialogue with power, have a dialogue with importance, more importantly, it's not that the artist is so interested in money, which he or she is, but in sustainability. How do you support your studio practice? So I met, a few years back, I met Frank Stella, and I was talking about how, I'm doing very well, but I am still broke because I'm still spending all of my money, developing the new pieces. And he's like, I'm exactly the same way. Basically, artists make enough money to support their addiction to continue creating. And that's what we're all kind of in the same boat. I've never met an artist who has a stash and a buffer of money behind them. So how is it that the conservation of your own artwork can be more than a sale, an acquisition of a piece by a foundation, the establishment of a mutually beneficial relationship with that foundation? So many of my collectors are people who buy or museums that buy like 3, 4, 5 pieces. And that's because we establish a relationship with their conservation department. We try and make sure that when these artworks arrive, there's already like a blueprint for how to conserve it. So I can talk much more, but that's good.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rafael, for summing this up. The next panelist is also an artist, Mariano Sadon, with a different approach. So Mariano Sadon is coming from Argentina. He studied physics at the University of Buenos Aires and is known professor and chair of the electronic art degree at the Universidad Nacional de 3 de Febrero in Buenos Aires. He received awards like Arco Beep Prize for Electronic Arts, which he received in 2019 at Arco, and the Connex Prize in Visual Art category in 2012. And he is a dear friend of Ars Electronica. He exhibited in the framework of the Ars Electronica Festival already a few times and within Ars Electronica Export, so this is also why we know each other quite well. His work has been shown also at the 57th Biennale di Venezia in 2017, as well as many museums and galleries worldwide. In the moment, Mariano Sadon is working together with the Ars Electronica archive. And yeah, so Mariano, we are happy to hear actually the first time what you're going to develop.
My name is Mariano Sadon. I am an Argentinian artist who used to work in transdisciplinary projects in between art and neuroscience at the Universidad Nacional de 3 de Febrero in Buenos Aires. I will present today our project Ars Semantica, which is a data science research by an interdisciplinary team and different institutions, as you can see. Ars Semantica deals with data visualization and art. We are interested in the correlation of relevant terms using machine learning tools in Ars Electronica archive. We study how some terms appear, evolve and fade along the time in electronic art context and compare them to those relevant topics in art theory, science and technology. We also explore how terms in science, technology, and art textual corpuses change in time semantically. Everybody may know the Google Ngrams viewer. It is an online search engine that charts the frequencies of any set of words using a yearly count found in printed sources. You can see the evolution in time of certain terms like, for example, cybernetics, generative, bioart, deep learning, artificial intelligence, and so on. But how terms affect the other ones? In the paper, Fading of Collective Attention Shapes the Evolution of Linguistic Variants, authors studied the competition between alternative linguistic forms in changing language. They studied the case of the Spanish past subjunctive, the evolution of its two competing forms, the ending in ra and the ending in se, which was perturbated by the appearance of the Royal Spanish Academy in 1713. That reinforced the spelling of both forms as perfectly interchangeable variants at a moment in which the ra ending form was predominant. This regulation produced a rediscovering and a novelty for the old form, se, which once faded, left the ra again as the dominant form up to the present day. This time evolution results in monotonic growth or decays, and such dynamics can be also applied in lifetimes that range from hours for memes and news to decades for verbs. The paper suggested us to study the evolution model in time for concepts, and how the appearance of a novelty can transform the evolution of uses of terms in different contexts like art, science, and technology are. In another paper, Quantitative Philology of Introspection, authors took digitized archives and traced the cultural evolution of introspective thought from the axial age to the 20th century cultural records. They apply a latent semantic analysis, a high-dimensional associative model that captures semantic similarity between words. According to this, we studied the evolution of semantically associated concepts along time in different art, science, and technology archives of textual corpuses. So, we look for how novelties are appropriated and in time, and how they are semantically associated and thus resignified in different contexts. Ars Electronica archive, by nature, is a significant testimony of a kind of hybrid textual and also visual example of intertwined expressions in art, science, and technology. Of course, at the end, it implies the society, because it is the way scientists, technologists, and artists deal and negotiate terms symbolically in culture. According to all these former considerations, one of our first goals is to look for intrinsic structure of data, usually hidden, handling and grouping it with common properties. By using techniques of machine learning, we are analyzing the more frequent topics along the time in Ars Electronica archive, science and nature publications for the moment. We developed the algorithm in each archive year by year separately. We ask for the emergence of the most significant terms in clusters. Using TSNE algorithms, we visualize semantic associations and distances between topics. By means of dimensional reduction, each term is projected into a space where semantic meaning is just its corresponding vector. Due to this, we have the topics and their semantic space evolving in time. We repeat the same process for each archive. Finally, we compare time evolution of those semantic spaces, looking for correspondences or not in time. We ask for comparisons of the semantically connected concepts in between each archive. We find this kind of procedures very valuable tools for archives. They can be alternative approach to critical or theoretical studies in art, science, and technology for researchers and users of archives. We are working in visualization design and interfaces for handling information that can give good tools for accessing archives with some degree of intelligence in the middle. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mariano. And now I would like to introduce you to Dagmar Schink, here on stage, live at the Ars Electronica Festival. Dagmar Schink studied at the University of Art and Design here in Linz and at the University of Art in Helsinki. After working at the OK Offenes Kulturhaus, and which is actually an art institution here in Linz, where the Cyber Arts exhibition is taking place. And she was working also at the Crossing Europe Film Festival. She moved back to the university, where she was then establishing the Valley Export Center. And since 2016, you are the head and the managing director of the center. In addition, Dagmar Schink is member of the Cultural Advisory Board of the City of Linz and is a requested jury member for diverse juries and member of the UNESCO City of Media Arts Advisory Board. Thank you very much that you are with us and looking forward to know more about the Valley Export Center.
Thank you, Manuela, for the nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me and having me here at this panel to Christina Radner and the whole team of the Ars Electronica Center to make this possible. It was as early as in the 1960s that Valley Export, a pioneer of media and performance art, started to build up a substantial archive, which was in 2015 acquired as a premature legacy by her native city of Linz and incorporated into the collections of the Lentos Kunstmuseum. In this cooperation, the University of Art and Design is responsible for the employees and the research operations with the aim to create a professional condition for artistic and scientific research. The Valley Export Center is located in the Tabakfabrik Linz, an industrial complex designed by Peter Behrens and Alexander Popp, built in the years 1929 to 1935. Born and raised in the close neighborhood, the location used to be a favorite place of Valley Export curiosity during her childhood. The design of the cigarette brand, Smart Export, once manufactured there, also inspired Valley Export when she selected her artist alias, which she has carried since 1967. The spatial concept developed by the architects Klebot and Dolnik for the new center is designed to be open and multifunctional. Since November 2017, the Valley Expo Center has provided researchers and scientific exploration and establishes a link to the contemporary artist practices. The relevant target audience are national and international researchers from various disciplines. The archival material depicts the career of Valley Export in all its facets. The consistently built-up archive reaches back to Valley Export's school days, which are mirrored in drawings and exercise books. It is important to outline that the center is not in possession of the artworks, which are still in collections, film archives, or with the artists. The materials outline the process from the first idea of the artwork, which are documented also in the materials and which are visible then for the reception and their presentation in the art market and in the art world. The mission of the Valley Export Center is to study and reappraise, as well as to mediate and contextualize the renowned artist's premature legacy. A parallel objective, of course, is to establish a network with other archives in order to exchange on innovative possibilities in archiving and in the provision of documents concerning ephemeral art practices. Posters, invitations, and reviews give evidence of Valley Export's presence in the public sphere. Research materials as lectures, slides, correspondences document Valley Export in various roles. For example, the international teacher, the artist-based researcher, and the curator. The center is also in hold of Valley Export's library, containing a great number of important books on media, theory, film and art sciences, feminism, of course, philosophy, and literature. We are still in the making, developing our tools and knowledge. And the archive continues to grow as the artist is still active. The ongoing inventory of digitization of the holdings commenced right after the opening of the Valley Export Center. We are currently working on a web-based interface that will allow us to link different databases and provide an online access for external researchers, always having the question of the rights situation in mind and on focus. In fall 27, we celebrated our opening with an exhibition at the Lentus Kunstmuseum curated by Sabine Folli, the director of the Valley Export Center. And this exhibition was traveling then from Linz to Berlin and Montreal and was slightly changed and spatially adjusted to the locations. The format of the exhibition accompanies us in contextualizing and mediating the archival content and enables us to develop new forms of displays for the various venues. An ideal format to share and exchange knowledge are conferences, panels, and lectures. The opening conference was addressing the different roles within archives under the title of Wilde Archive, Unruly Archives, Art and its Paper Trails. Archivists, artists, activists, collectors, curators, and lecturers were invited to build a substantial network with the aim to enlarge and strengthen it. Within the frame of lectures, seminars, and workshops, we are also encouraging young artists and theorists to develop their own approach to the themes and topics gathered in the research center. The example depicted shows a new work by David Wittinghofer based on his exploration of the TV trilogy by Valley Export, realized in the early 1980s, named The Armed Eye, Valley Export in a Dialogue with the Film Avant-Garde. I mention this work as a representative of many projects that we have been able to accompany and made possible so far, since the video will be shown on Sunday in the cinema within the tribute to Valley Export organized by the Crossing Europe Film Festival. During the processing of the archive material, we repeatedly encounter bundles of research material, which can then be combined and traced back to lectures, concept drafts, or, and as in this case, with an unfinished screenplay. These archival finds are presented in the format of an archival glimpses set, 2 display cases at the Valley Export Center Linz, with contents that change every 3 months, provide insights into the archive on the basis of physical documents from the premature legacy. As a part of our research work, the Valley Export Center Linz edited a bilingual unfinished script of Valley Export called The Virtual Body, From the Prosthetic to the Post-Biological Body, which the artist wrote at the end of the 1990s. The publication is a cooperation between the Neuer Berliner Kunstverein and the Valley Export Center Linz and was edited by Sabine Folli and Marius Babias. So we work on a living archive, in a living archive and together with the artist. Aside from being a pioneer in media and performance art, Valley Export has actively managed, thanks to her foresight and also to her endurance, to provide a contemporary document on which we and future archivists, activists, artists, and theorists can build on. We look forward to having a productive interaction with artists, researchers, and all interested persons in the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dagmar. Thank you very much. We prepared questions, and actually my first question, Oliver, would be a question directly to you. It's about archives and museums, more or less, so a historical perspective, or let's start with a historical perspective. Because the question is, so how can museums collect and preserve digital culture? So, and which role do online archives actually play towards that goal? Or what would be your thought about it?
Yeah, let me start with adoring Rafael's great systematic work on preservation. I think it's a really I highly value that. Although I still think that artists should focus on their creative work and not also have the job of the conservators in the end. But I share the need at the moment that this information needs to come from the artist and then the question is where these specialists should sit in the artist studio or in the museum, or should they float around so that they also can do service for collectors, so that more digital artworks would end up in private collections, which would be of course also another goal. I think a concerted network of museums in countries where we have tax-paying societies would be helpful, since the individual museum is not able to deal with all the complexity of the technology. But if you share the responsibilities, for example, a country like Germany, where you have 700 art museums in total, and if only 5 museums would participate in such a 5% of the museums would participate in such a network, so 35 museums, then Bavaria could have participate with 5 museums responsible for the preservation of interactive installations, Brandenburg for net art, Saxony for something else, and so on. And those museums, this museum network would be informed by the online archives. So in Austria by ADA and by Electronica, in Germany by ZKM, in Switzerland the HEC, and other countries by other archives, for example. We started such an initiative right before Corona in Frankfurt at the National Library. There was a meeting of stakeholders. There were also Christa Sommerer and Wendy Koons and people from the ministry and so on to start a process of thinking and creating such a network and thinking what is needed to do that. And of course, we're also looking for international alliances with other countries where we have a similar tax situation like France and Canada and so on. Of course, also we know that also in the US, museums start to think collaboratively by buying artworks together and then probably also do the preservation.
Yeah, maybe I would also like to ask actually Christiane Paul, if we still stick a little bit to the also historical view on it, on the role of archives, because I can assume, I mean, you started Artport actually also very early in 2001, and what do you think are the main goals still the same than when you started, or how this actually developed, or how you see the development here?
Yeah, many thanks. I would actually broaden that question a little bit. I think on the one hand, you might argue that archives as a collection of historical documents or records always have had the goal to bring materials together and to create a shared resource as much as that is possible given the technology. But I believe that what we need now more than ever is really a living archive. Even if works have entered a museum collection, artists will want to make changes over time. This is happening to us at the Whitney all the time. And we created a GitHub repository where these changes to artworks can be documented. And I'm not even talking about preservation, but just the fact that every digital artwork is very much alive. I think a profoundly new component that has been introduced to archives is just the database and the fact that you can introduce this relational element to establishing connections. And what we need now more than ever is really shared access between institutions and metadata. I briefly mentioned the Media Preservation Initiative at the Whitney. So what it's trying to do is really to create a resource space with the work itself, artist interviews, installation images, and correspondences, all of the material surrounding an artwork and establishing its context and making that
available to institutions that are co-owning and maybe even broadening that, so everybody has shared access to this resource space. What I believe is also incredibly important for archives is to really start automating certain conservation tasks and create archival storage and copies, for example, which is something that takes up a lot of resources.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christiane, also for this division between archives and actually the collections. My next question would be, especially also on this, also to Rafael, because of these archives and the market and the art market. If you compare how collections in museums come together and how online archives are developing, what could be a possible future for online archives? Or what do you see, how can artists be profiteers of this kind of online archives?
Well, I don't think that we should be profiteers of it, just like the online archives shouldn't be profiteers. I mean, I think that what we're trying to do is not so much profit, but just maintain operations. So sustainability is the word that I like to use instead. I'm very interested, of course, in archives being open and accessible. I'm very interested in what Christiane was saying about the relationship between the different metadata and the artworks. Mariano's presentation and showing how things are interconnected and sort of derive associations between them is super interesting for an artist, because I think that conservation is about this kind of desire to create a viral entity that gets adopted by future artists, and that in so doing, you're making a contribution to a larger dialogue. So that's super interesting. For me, online archives are a fundamental, sort of method through which we can, remain honest about how what we're doing is not new. They're progressions in traditions of experimentation. So that's a really important thing. To situate your practice inside of that can only happen if we have access to the information that places like ADA or the Ars Electronica archive or V2 or whatever have. So I do routinely, as I produce work, make sure I have an idea. I check on these archives, make sure that no one's done it before, or if they have, what is it that I can contribute that is different from what they did. I want to mention, though, that I do work routinely with archives in my own artwork. So the word performing the archive, like the Simon Osthoff idea of of taking over the archives as the actual content or material or concept of your artwork is interesting. So, for example, I worked just now, I worked with Stuart Hall's widow, and we worked with the totality of the work of Stuart Hall's incorporated into an artwork. We've done with Stéphane Mallarmé, with different kinds of authors, and we work with rights organizations to make sure that those archives, which we're performing in an artistic way, do lead to benefits also for the estate. For example, we're working right now with the estate of Julio Cortázar, because we were working with some of Cortázar's writing in one of my artworks. So there is an osmosis between the artwork and the archive that can be mutually beneficial, as we are all part of a domain of knowledge or the creation of relationships. I do want to mention, though, that Oliver's statement that my studio, is maybe not wanting to replace conservators, not at all. Conservators are fundamental agents in the process of making and presenting and preserving artwork. We have a lot of empathy for them because the winter is coming for them. The barrage of audiovisual material that is arriving on their desks and the diversity of it is daunting. They're not empowered enough. They don't have enough information. They need to be helped from all possible ways. So my studio, what we want is to empower conservators. We want them to have the information to be able to do their work without needing to use forensics. And so that's our contribution as a studio. And we don't see this as something that takes away from creating new work. It, in fact, helps us create new work, because it means that we can delegate the conservation of our artwork to the right institutions, and we can then continue working with whatever current obsession we have. So I just wanted to clarify that the studio really, really believes and champions the work of conservators.
Yeah, understood.
Oliver is actually absolutely confirming what you are saying in a moment. But going a little bit back also to this added value of archives and also the art market, Christiane, maybe you want to take over your position also as a curator and as an observer of the art market since a very long time, especially about media art and digital art. How can an online archive about media art contribute to or be of value for the art market? What do you think?
I believe an archive can be of tremendous value to the art market, if only indirectly. But I believe that the accessibility of information about artworks is really necessary to nurture an understanding of the medium and its aesthetics, which still is largely lacking when it comes to the mainstream art world. We still need to very much build the collector base for new media art. And now we see at art fairs more and more panels on collecting new media art, etc. But in a nutshell, we really need to build the understanding of the medium to also have it more collected. And another tremendous value of an archive is that it really relieves anxieties about preservation and maintenance. This is very much related to what Rafael has talked about, and he has been very good about making information available to collectors. Many collectors shy away from new media art because they think it's too complicated, it breaks, they don't know how to present it, maintain it within their homes. So I believe archives are of tremendous value when it comes to that.
You mentioned one point, so actually how these archives are actually in a very transdisciplinary approach, how things are coming together via different person and different skills. So my question also for you, Dagmar, would now be like, who are, if you speak about archived and involved parties, especially if the artist is still alive here also, so there's I think a lot of people coming into these archives, and not only the artist, but also her network, especially in case of Valley Export. But who are the drivers of archives? Who could be an involved, maybe even unusual party? After having heard also the talk from Rafael Lozano-Hemmer, how can archives help artists? What do you think to finance their artistic production and their life?
I think the short answer would be that archives enable access and transfer knowledge and understanding to a broader audience. So in my experience, most of the time artists are the drivers because they are aware that things might vanish. They are aware that they are not going down in art history and that this would be a necessity to do so. So I experience a lot of artists who want to hand over their collections or their material. Collection is a big word, but their material collected throughout the years. And even more and more art institutions are aware of that precious works and the precious information which might vanish. So I also experienced that universities and research labs are taking their role now actively, and more of these media art works are also taking into the canon of art history, which I think is really important. And as for the questions, who might be an unexpected party which might be involved in the future, I think students, the younger the better, come and visit all the archives. Archivists get ready to maintain the knowledge and transfer it to the young generation, because this might educate the people and make them aware what we are losing if we are not working on it.
Thank you. Thank you. about these networks, and I mean, actually we have the name of the panel is like networked archives. Oliver, you already mentioned it also in your talk. Can you maybe just clarify in 2 minutes what does a network archive actually mean for you, and how could we make steps actually towards such an alliance?
Yeah, as we know, there are different kinds of interfaces. So festival interface like Ars Electronica, then conference archives like IZEA or the mediahistory.org, and then also generally scholarly archives like ADA, and the question is how we can bring them, how we can create an international permanent supported infrastructure for research archives. And I think the model which Roger Molina from astronomy proposed, the virtual observatory, this is where all the astronomers work together doing research on the celestial data which they share, and the nations where they come from, the different observatories, they just pay a certain amount of money into this international fund, and so they could create such an international infrastructure, and that's what actually the Liverpool Declaration also asks for, that we create such an international research structure, and we will discuss this at the IZEA conference in October, and I invite the Ars Electronica community at a summit organized by IZEA, ADA, Ars Electronica, and SIGGRAPH, how to make the next steps towards such a structure, and if it should be, and we might discuss if it should be a metadata structure or a number of APIs, or if ADA or another main archives like IZEA archive would develop into a hub. And then also invite smaller archives and giving software away for free that they can share that. So generally, it would be fantastic if on this way we would also get access to remote documentation of the past, say Russian video art from the Cold War, global art from around the world, private collections of pioneers like Frida Nake, Jason Reichardt, or Itsuo Sakane, and many others. So this is the vision at the moment.
Now question to actually the artists in our panel, Mariano and Rafael. Networked archives, I mean, so in a concept it sounds quite well. I think it might get difficult practically spoken, especially if you want to get maybe if you want to use it for your artworks. Do you think it could be of value for artists?
Well, yeah. I was thinking in many of the topics you are talking about now, because it changes my mind at this moment. I think that, of course, the artistic approach to archives has to do with the kind of interest you have in the development of your pieces and which kind of data are you going to look for. But on the other hand, a kind of network of data for interchange between institutions, I was wondering that we used to think in an archive in a way to a person who is going to access for information and look for information. But I guess we have in the middle of a moment in which we have algorithms and machine learning that we have to access to archives also, and you need so many protocols for data transferring for algorithms also. They are very important tools for us for research and also for artistic expression. And this kind of metadata sharing, as Christine has observed before, I find is very, very important to so many archives who have so many information for accessing, but it's not still prepared for machine learning, so all kind of tools, it's despite the persons, of course. And because we are now creating a kind of acknowledgement augmented in a sense, because you use other tools for accessing information. So one of the things I would like to get involved in a kind of network, I can share this kind of metadata. And another thing that I find interesting in terms of the data could be considered something that very strategic. And on the other hand, we used to manage a huge amount of data, mainly with mathematic tools or whatever. But also it's interesting from my side, this small data, this
small data that can reveal something unexpected. And we used to deal with big data. But in the other hand, so many minorities or gender matters, so many things are invisible in terms of a huge amount of data. So also to put a kind of observation, a spatial observation on small data and have tools to discover certain correlation between that data and content could be change our mind respect to certain process of the cultural development. This is what I'd like to say for the moment.
I'd like to just add that I really agree with that idea, Mariano, that the small data is interesting, especially when you think about the fact that an archive is not a neutral entity, right? Like an archive is a will to power, is this megalomaniacal thing that pretends to be exhaustive, but only highlights so many aspects that it itself is missing. So as a tool of power and as a tool of domination, it needs to be approached critically. And I think that the artists are good at that. It doesn't mean that we don't believe that archives should exist. Of course they should, but they should also be contested as fragile structures, as architectures that that themselves, represent a very specific domination. The gatekeepers of this kind of what should be remembered or not, especially in a field like media art where, there's not enough, sort of relationship to the historical traditions. In my opinion, that's changing. I think that, all of us here are aware of precedents and we'll keep on bringing them up. But it does seem to me that there is an enormous amount of artists being created right now in institutions throughout the world that are not looking at precedents. And so the archive question is, especially if they're open archives, is the capability for us to have these minor histories also be highlighted and given a role and a play in the history of this medium.
I couldn't agree with you more. Of course, when you generate data, you generate a framework, a cultural framework at the same time. So art position is really appropriate for to give a kind of insight on the way you generate data, because despite you use big data that is, generated by a massive amount of people working with information. At the same time, when you create a work, sometimes you need a specific data that you can't access or you have no way to do in order to, you have to generate your own data because it has meaning for you. And this kind of reflection in between what is important for your data, your cosmovision of the world is not necessarily the big amount of data. So archives in between institutions has to, from my point of view, to reflect about these topics in a more transcultural aspect. I don't know.
This brings me actually to my last question. And now when we speak about the architecture of these archives, when we speak about open archives and maybe closed archives or archives that actually are both, so some part is open, some parts are closed, and if we speak also about exclusivity, especially also Rafael mentioned in his talk, so there is of course this open approach in the way that he suggesting that artists actually are giving the code and so on, but then there is a certificate, a special certificate of exclusivity of the artwork. And if we think about an archive now, so how can we, could this even be a model for archives? Rafael?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that archives need to be living things. They need to be changing by definition. If they are closed and certified, then that's bad. Maybe the certification is a different kind of certification, which is just a kind of cultural weight, right? Like you trust more an archive that has open access, that, that has curation, that has a structure, that has an interface that helps you. And it's all about legitimation, right? So if you are in a particular archive and this archive is particularly using best practices of dissemination of knowledge, access, and they're the custodians of this information, the curators of it, then that has you know, a little bit more weight. It's almost like fake news. You know, I could make an archive. In fact, artists make, as Mariano was saying, entire cosmologies of fake archives. You know, that's what we do. But I think that at a time of fake news and at a time of I can't believe I'm saying this, but I mean, I grew up on postmodernism and structural.
We have to take about time, Rafael.
Yeah. And I want to quickly throw one thing in. I don't think that these are mutually exclusive issues. The blockchain has been very effectively used also to establish kinds of exclusivity, authenticity within an open archive model.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much that actually there was a discussion coming together. Thank you, Christiane. Thank you, Rafael. Thank you very much, Mariano. Also, thank you, Oliver and Dagmar here on the stage. It was really a pleasure for us at Ars Electronica that we did it live with you, also connected via Zoom. Yeah, let's rock the pandemic situation. See you next year.
See you.
See you.